you all, you anonymous, faceless people out there in the listening world, for joining us today, and thanks to the CED for inviting me to speak. The research that I'm going to be talking with you about today is part of a grant-sponsored research study that was funded by the WVU CED as part of their mini-grant program. So I'm excited to be able to share with you some of our preliminary findings from that study and talk to you a little bit about how we might help to facilitate successful transitions into meaningful employment for individuals with autism spectrum disorders and comorbid intellectual disabilities. And I can't get my computer to advance. There we go. All right, so when typically developing individuals think about career paths, that's often a pretty daunting thought process or conversation for those individuals. And there's lots of different career options. Adolescents are often not exposed even to what those career paths might be. So if you think about your own experiences and the extent to which you were able to think as an early adolescent, did you envision yourself doing what you're doing today? I think for many of us, those career paths have changed across time. And eventually, really what we're looking for in our vocational training and vocational career paths is that we land in a job where we enjoy what we're doing, that it brings us some form of happiness. And this can be this path to outrageous happiness, as Linus would put it, can be a daunting exercise for even typically developing individuals. In part, that's because choosing a career path, there's so many different options that are available to typically developing individuals for which we require specific skill sets and specific aptitudes to be successful in those. And it becomes very challenging to try to determine what it is that we're going to do when we grow up. As I mentioned, this is challenging even for typically developing individuals, but we can begin pretty early in doing this, and we do start early with most of our children. So we talk with them about what our career paths are. There's Bring Your Sons and Daughters to Work Day. In high school, when adolescents start to think about those transitions into career planning and vocational paths, there's guidance counseling often available to them to be able to assist with those transitions. In college, we've got majors where we're providing specific training to individuals that prepare them for very particular career paths. And we have broad career services that are available within our universities to help promote appropriate job seeking and career success for our students. So when we talk about the career paths for typically developing students, generally what we're doing is we're talking with people with adolescents about their likes and dislikes. So what is it that you like to do? What do you find enjoyable? What kinds of careers do you see yourself doing? And then trying to link those to possible career paths for the individual. These strategies, so talking with individuals about what their likes and dislikes are and using specific inventories to try to link those likes and dislikes to career paths become much more difficult to use with individuals with autism spectrum disorders or that have limited vocal communication abilities. So imagine asking career path questions like, what is it that you really like to do? I think when you are talking about individuals who have limited vocal communication skills and who might not have the skills necessary to answer abstract WH questions, answering questions about what is it that you like to do that has no clear answer is very difficult for these individuals and might limit the extent to which we can use those traditional inventories to facilitate the success of our students. So when that's the case, when we're working with students for whom we have these limited individualized communication skills and we can't really assess using our traditional metrics, we're left with maybe some barriers to identifying appropriate vocational activities for those individuals. And these barriers aren't just me making things up or speaking hypothetically. There are some real startling statistics having to do with the employment outcomes for individuals with autism spectrum disorders and intellectual disabilities. For example, 2 years after graduating from high school, more than 50% of young adults with an autism spectrum disorder remain unemployed. So we have more than half of our young adults with ASD who are not meaningfully or gainfully employed. When we do have meaningful employment, so in that 50%, it's less than their same age peers with other forms of disabilities. So we're seeing individuals with autism spectrum disorders who are behind the curve, even relative to other individuals of the same age who have different forms of disabilities. And for the less than 50% who are employed, they work only about 5 hours a week on average, and they make salaries well under the poverty line. So we clearly have a lot of room to grow in terms of creating meaningful vocational outcomes for adolescents and young adults with ASD. Now, there's lots of barriers that might go into creating these meaningful vocational outcomes for individuals. And those have to do potentially with, for example, some of the skill sets that are necessary for employment, the types of employment opportunities that are available in areas, particularly rural areas, as well as the extent to which individuals with limited communication abilities can appropriately seek additional training and resources. So even once employed, there's, I think, some barriers to remaining employed. Before we get to that point, though, there are additional barriers that might prevent individuals with an autism spectrum disorder from being able to identify even what an appropriate career would be. Now, we know that the career paths for individuals with disabilities, and in fact this is true for typically developing individuals as well, are much more promising when those individuals are in a vocation that they enjoy. So how do we then identify vocations that individuals with an autism spectrum disorder and potentially limited communication repertoires might enjoy? And then think back to those examples that we just talked about of how we might do that with a typically developing individual. So again, with typically developing individuals, we typically have these vocal conversations about likes and dislikes. These are a little bit more complicated, as I mentioned before, for individuals with disabilities, but they are out there. So one of the commonly used alternatives is called the Reading Free Vocational Interest Inventory, which was developed by Ralph Becker. And the Reading Free Vocational Interest Inventory was designed to provide an alternative way for individuals to assess the likes and dislikes of adolescents and young adults who had difficulty communicating or reading, and so who had those limited language repertoires. So let me give you an example of the instructions from the Reading Free Vocational Interest Inventory. They look like this. So this is, I know this is probably itty-bitty on your screens. It says, this is not a test. There are no right or wrong answers. Your answers will tell us about the kind of work that you like best. On each page of this booklet, there are groups of 3 pictures in a straight row, just like the 3 pictures at the bottom of this page. Look at the example below. If you liked the picture of best, if you liked best the picture of building a wall, you would make a large circle on this picture, just like the one made in the example. You can only choose one picture in each group of 3, so choose the one that you like best. If you like all 3 pictures, you must decide on only one, so make a large circle on the picture you like best. If you do not like any of the 3 pictures, choose the one that you would do only for a very short time. There are 55 pictures of people working at different jobs, just like the pictures at the bottom of this page. Be sure you circle one picture in each group of the 55 rows of pictures. Turn the page and begin. So, although this inventory is designed for individuals who have limited reading skills, one of the things that became apparent to me in looking at the inventory is that the receptive language skills that are necessary to understand these instructions are still pretty significant. So the instructions are relatively clearly worded, but they require some pretty complex choice making and complex discrimination from the people who are answering. Additionally, they may present pictures of things that the individual has never experienced before. So I don't know about you, but I have never personally built a wall. And so the extent to which I might be able to say, yeah, I would really like to build a wall, might be unclear because I've never had that personal experience in my life to know how much I really like building a wall. The other potential barrier with some of these pictures is that they require that the individual be able to infer from line drawings to real life, and that they make particular discriminations within the line drawing. So for example, in the second picture over, we're presuming that the responding adolescent knows that they're selecting that this is serving the food and not eating the food. If these complex repertoires aren't in place for our adolescents with autism, then inventories like the Reading Free Interest Inventory may not be appropriate for us to use. Despite some of the barriers associated with using things like the Reading Free Interest Inventory, these inventories are often commonly used in educational programming for adolescents with autism in the public school system. The one that's most commonly used, or that I've seen the most often in North Central West Virginia, is this one called the Pictorial Interest Inventory. The Pictorial Interest Inventory is a modified version of the Reading Free Interest Inventory, and the directions, as you can see on the page, are simpler than they are for the Reading Free Interest Inventory. And the Pictorial Interest Inventory was designed to reduce one of the barriers that I just mentioned with the Reading Free Interest Inventory, which is that it uses actual pictures of individuals engaging in tasks rather than line drawings. However, there are still some of the same barriers associated with the Pictorial Interest Inventory as there are with things like the Reading Interest Inventory. So for example, if I've never served as a mechanic on a car, never changed an oil or worked on an engine, I might not know how much I would like that particular task. The second problem is that I might attend to features of these pictures that are not the features that I, as a respondent, might attend to features of the pictures that are not the features that the administrator of the inventory wants me to attend to. For example, I might pick the second picture because that woman looks the most like me, regardless of whether I would really like to be a librarian the most or not. So as we've discussed, there are some workarounds and some modifications to the interviews that are typically used with individuals who have complex verbal skills. But there remain some potential problems with those activities. They require picture-to-activity matching skills. So when we're using something like the Picture Interest Inventory or the Reading Free Interest Inventory, we're presuming that the individual to whom we're administering that inventory can match or has a sense of that this picture means this thing. But often those skills are not directly assessed. Second, and as I've mentioned repeatedly now, they may show pictures that the individual's never done before. So it's unclear the extent to which, if someone says, circles that or nominates that activity as a highly preferred activity, if that's really what they're saying I would like to do, because they may not have had those skills or that experience before. Third, the preference we know that preference is relative. So while I might prefer to be a librarian over being a mechanic, I might prefer another job over being a librarian. And not all of these modified inventories include every picture pitted against every other picture. So when we say that something is highly preferred or that it's nominated often, those only hold within the context of the other opportunities or the other options that were available when it was presented. And fourth, and like I've already mentioned, individuals may attend to inappropriate parts of the pictures, like the extent to which an individual shown in a pictorial interest inventory looks like they do, rather than the task that they're doing. Despite these limitations, we know that there are other ways that we can identify preferences for individuals. And there are two ways that are well established within the applied behavior analysis literature. These two methods are called paired choice preference assessment and multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessments. In each of these assessment kinds, the individual is given direct choices between two or more activities. It's two in your paired choice and several activities in your multiple stimulus without replacement assessment. And the extent to which an individual selects one of the two activities when it's presented is measured systematically across time. These two forms of preference assessments have been well established in the literature for accurately identifying events that function as rewards or reinforcers that can improve client outcomes for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. There's also limited evidence in the literature that paired choice and multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessments can be used to identify vocational preferences for young adults with an autism spectrum disorder or other intellectual or developmental disability. But to date, those studies have been limited, and there have not been a direct comparison of the two different methods of identifying preferences for vocational tasks. Therefore, what we wanted to do in the current study was to determine if these two preference assessment formats, paired choice preference assessments and multiple stimulus preference assessments, that involve direct access and measurement of activities, can provide this direct measure of vocational preferences for students who have poor verbal abilities. So we targeted students who had an autism spectrum disorder and an intellectual or developmental disability. We recruited these individuals from the local high schools in Mon County, and we to date have 4 participants who have enrolled. I'll talk about them today based on pseudonyms that we've given to them. Harold was a 17-year-old male diagnosed with autism. In his individualized education plan, he had data from a universal nonverbal intelligence test that put him in the very delayed and impaired range. Harold had 3 vocational goals in his IEP. They were to increase pre-vocational skills with 80% accuracy on tasks, to demonstrate appropriate work behavior, and to master progressively harder vocational tasks. Trevor was a 15-year-old male diagnosed with autism. He had a WISC verbal score of 53 and had no transition or vocational goal specified in his IEP. Adam was a 17-year-old male diagnosed with autism level 3. Although he had a recent WISC documented in his IEP, the administrator of that assessment determined that it was too low to score. He had one vocational goal in his IEP, which was to determine if he would like to attend our local technical and vocational training center. Molly was a 17-year-old female with autism and Down syndrome who had a DASH developmental age of 48 to 60 months as documented in her IEP. She had one IEP goal related to vocational skills, which was to follow a schedule using least to greatest prompting for 100% completion of the work schedule. We had several things that we did before we started our experiment proper. So before starting, the very first thing that we did was we interviewed the parents and the teachers to identify possible tasks and tasks to avoid. We wanted to make sure that we were starting with tasks that the individuals who were familiar with our participants thought would be good tasks, and also that we were avoiding any tasks that might be contraindicated for that particular student. So things that they thought they would really dislike or anything that involved handling a substance that the individual may be allergic to. So we generated lists from the parent and the teacher, and then my original plan, and I had really high hopes for this, was that I was going to read the student's individualized education plan for their transition-related goals, and I was going to include those activities in our assessment. Well, if you haven't figured out from the previous slide, the vocational goals that were included in our students' IEPs were pretty nonspecific. And so, unfortunately, our individualized education plans did not provide a lot of guidance about what might be an appropriate goal for the students. So primarily based on the teacher and parent interview, we selected 8 tasks that we included, 8 possible vocational tasks that were identified by either the teacher or the parent as being something that they thought that the student might enjoy. We wanted to make sure that our students had experienced each of the tasks, so we provided exposure to the tasks while showing a picture of what the task materials were. These initial exposures were 2 minutes in duration. After the participant had experienced each of the 8 tasks for 2 minutes, We then, on the next day, asked the participant to match the picture of the task items to the task. So we set out two different sets of task items and handed the participant a picture. We asked the participant to take the picture to the related task items. Now again, remember that one of the things that is necessary for us to use pictures when we're identifying preferences is that the individual can match the picture to the actual task. So this was pretty important to us to make sure that our participants knew what they were picking when they selected among pictures. And we wanted to use pictures because we wanted to have an array of 8 items that were all able to be presented equidistantly from the participant to make the effort of selecting easy. And it's really hard to present 8 sets of vocational tasks all within the same table. Now, we ran into some difficulty in working with Molly. Molly did not engage with the task during the initial 2-minute exposures. And so we thought that perhaps we had missed tasks that she might enjoy. We replaced the task based on new discussions with the parent and teacher, but Molly still only engaged with 4 of those tasks. So for Molly, from this point, those initial exposures on, we proceeded with just including the 4 tasks in the picture to item matching assessment. Unfortunately, Molly did not accurately match any of the pictures to the corresponding items. Now remember that I wanted to use pictures initially because I had 8 different sets of vocational tasks, some of which included large items like brooms, that I couldn't easily put within reach of the participants. For Molly, all 4 of her items associated with her vocational tasks were relatively small and could be placed on the table in front of her. So because we didn't know if she had picture-to-object matching skills, we stopped using pictures with Molly, and we just presented the actual items in front of her and asked her to select between items. However, Molly did not select between task-related items when she was asked to do so. At this point, we were unsure if Molly didn't have the skills to understand our instruction to select between the tasks when they were presented to her in an array of 4, or if Molly was choosing not to choose, so to speak. That is, if Molly was essentially saying, I don't want to do any of these, and so was deliberately not selecting. We had plans for how to modify our procedures, but unfortunately Molly was withdrawn from school before we could make further modifications. So our remaining 3 participants, that is Trevor, Harold, and Adam, experienced our experimental procedures. Those started with 2 different forms of preference assessments, the multiple stimulus without replacement, or MSWO assessment, and the paired choice assessment. During the MSWO, we placed all of the pictures in an arc on the table in front of the participant. The student selected one of the pictures, we removed the remainder of the pictures, and had the student complete that selected task for 2 minutes. During the 2 minutes with the task, the student received attention every 15 seconds. If the student was working and on task, that attention was in the form of praise. You're doing a nice job working. I like how you're doing whatever the task was. If the student was off task, then we provided prompts and models or assisted the student if it seemed like the student had gotten stuck on the task. After the 2 minutes were completed, the instructor removed the selected picture, represented the remaining pictures, and after the first selection, this was 7, rotating the location of those pictures to ensure that the participant wasn't just selecting an item or a picture based on the location of the picture, and then repeated the process of having the participant select a picture, the participant completed the task for 2 minutes, and then representing the remaining pictures until no pictures remained. We repeated that entire series 3 times, having all 8 pictures out and then going all the way down until there were no pictures remaining, and then we did that 3 times. In our paired choice assessment, each picture was paired with every other picture twice. So just 2 pictures were presented at a time, and then each picture was paired with every other picture, where in the first presentation, picture A would be on the left, and in the second presentation, picture A would be on the right. Except for the change in the number of pictures that were available, the other procedures were largely the same. The student selected a picture between one of the 2 available options and then completed the selected task for 2 minutes, receiving attention every 15 seconds. And this continued until all of the pairings were presented twice. Just to give you an idea of what this looked like, and this is an actual picture of our pictures. So this is the table in Harold's classroom, and what you see are the pictures of the activities that were selected for Harold. They're arranged in an arc on the table, and Harold would sit at the chair and select a picture. So from left to right, those pictures are assembling bags of school supplies, sweeping, matching and folding socks, shredding paper, filing, transcribing, folding paper, and stuffing envelopes. Now, once Harold selected one of the pictures from the array, he did that picture or did the activity associated with that picture for 2 minutes before coming back and selecting from the remaining pictures. So from here, I want to show you some outcome data of what we saw across our 2 assessments. I'll show you these data for all 3 of the participants who completed our preference assessments. In all of these slides, the data from the multiple stimulus without replacement, or MSWO assessment, that's the one with the pictures in the arc, are on the left, and the one with the paired choice assessment, where the participant is given just 2 options at a time, are on the right. For all of these graphs, the percentage of presentations with selections are along the y-axis. So the taller those bars are, the more often the participant selected that picture when it was available as an option. The different options from most selected to least selected appear along the x-axis. So for Harold, he selected shredding as an option every single time it was available in the MSWO assessment, and about 95% of the time that it was available in the paired choice assessment. So for Harold, both forms of the assessments identified shredding as the highest preferred option of the available array. However, the lowest preferred option differed across the 2 assessments. The multiple stimulus without replacement assessment identified transcribing as the lowest preferred option, but sweeping was identified as the lowest preferred option in the paired choice assessment. So the 2 assessments identified the same highest preferred item, or highest preferred activity, but different lowest preferred activities for Harold. Here are the data for Trevor. The graphs are laid out the same way. The taller the bar, the more often Trevor selected a particular activity when it was available, and the shorter the bar, the less often Trevor selected that particular activity when it was available. Results were similar for Trevor as they were for Harold, in that both assessments identified the same activity as being the highest preferred activity, greeting people, but different activities as the lowest preferred activities. And in fact, for Trevor, the lowest preferred activity in the MSWO, which was cleaning, was pretty much in the middle of the pack for the paired choice. There were 3 other vocational tasks that were identified as by the paired choice assessment as being less preferred than cleaning. So though there was correspondence with the highest preferred task, there was lack of correspondence in identifying a full preference hierarchy. If we needed more than one vocational task for Trevor, it might be difficult to determine which of those preference hierarchies was more appropriate. Here are the results for Adam. Again, the taller the bars, the more often Adam selected a particular task. Both types of preference assessments identified delivering mail as the highest preferred task. But again, the lowest preferred task differed across the 2 assessments, with matching socks being selected as the lowest preferred in the paired choice, but being in the bottom 3 with 2 other options less preferred in the MSWO. So what did we learn from these data? The same highest preferred task was identified in both types of preference assessments, but that highest preferred task differed across individuals. Even when similar tasks were included across students, the students had different preferences. For example, cleaning was one of Trevor's lowest preferred activities, but it was in the top 3 highest preferred for Adam. These results suggest that we can't just presume that all individuals with a particular diagnosis will like to do the same kinds of activities. It's very important that we assess the individual preferences of the students with whom we work to make sure that we're providing solid vocational training opportunities that will match that student's likes and dislikes. The two different assessment procedures identified different lowest preferred tasks for each student, in addition to identifying different preferences between the students. Thus, although the assessments had good correspondence with the highly preferred activities, there were seemingly differences in how the procedures yielded outcomes, and those differences seemed worthy of further exploration. If we were interested in just identifying a single highest preferred activity for an individual that would be a single vocational task, it seemed like it would be difficult to select between the two assessments. Therefore, we did a secondary analysis of our preference assessment data to look at the amount of time that was necessary to complete the two assessments. Because time is a precious commodity, it's really important that we select the most efficient assessment when outcomes are equivalent. Here are the data on the mean time to complete the two assessment types across the three participants for whom we collected preference assessment data. Although both assessments identified the same highly preferred activities, the paired choice assessment took about twice as long to complete as the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. These graphs show the means where the error bars are the standard deviations. So our paired choice assessment is taking about 160 to 170 minutes to complete, whereas our MSWO is taking about 75 minutes to complete. So again, if we were only interested in identifying a single highly preferred task, it seems like the MSWO would be the way to go. But these data still don't tell us the entire story. There are some potential problems with how we arrange these analyses. First, our participants still only had a relatively short time to work on the task. That is, they selected a task from the array of available options and then only worked on that task for about 2 minutes. During that 2-minute time, they received lots of attention. So one of us attended to the participant about every 15 seconds. This is unlike a real work environment where a supervisor is unlikely to be able to attend to a participant that frequently. Third, there was a choice before each task that the participant had to complete. This is also probably unlike a real work environment. As much as I would love to have free latitude to choose what I'm going to do at any particular point in my day, I often have constraints on my time that are placed by my supervisors. I'm told, essentially, what I need to get done at what time of day. So our procedures identified preferences, but it was unclear the extent to which they would actually predict whether participants would be able to work for longer periods of time when there was no choice available. That is, the conditions that are more like a real work environment. Our answer to this was to conduct an additional analysis where we presented single tasks for longer durations without as much attention. We called this additional analysis our engagement assessment because we were really interested in the extent to which our participants would remain engaged and focused on the task at hand when there were not as many choices, not as much attention and prompting, and they had to work for longer periods of time. We wanted to see if our preference assessments would predict which tasks the participants would remain engaged. That is, would participants remain more engaged with the tasks that were labeled or identified as highly preferred in our preference assessments relative to the tasks that were identified as being low preferred in our preference assessments. This is how we did the analysis. We identified the highest preferred task. Remember that that was, for all participants, that was the same across both assessments. And then the two low preferred tasks, and remember that these differed across the two assessments for all of our participants. So each of our participants had 3 different tasks. We determined which task the participant would work on, so there was no choice, much like a supervisor might tell an employee what to do next. For example, recall that Harold's highest preferred task was shredding in both preference assessments, and the lowest preferred tasks were typing and sweeping. So in each block of 3 sessions, we would decide whether Harold would shred, type, or sweep, and we would tell Harold what the next activity was. In each 10-minute session, Harold would do one of these 3 tasks. So Harold now had to work, our participants had to work for 10 minutes instead of just 2 minutes. And then as Harold worked during the 10-minute session, we checked in every 2 minutes. If the participant was working, we praised the work, and if the participant was not working, we reminded the participant to work or showed the participant what to do. Here are the data for our outcomes. These are the data for Harold. The percentage of the session of the 10-minute session that Harold spent engaged in the task is along the y-axis of this graph, and the consecutive sessions that we worked with Harold are along the x-axis. Remember that we selected which activity Harold would do, and he did it for the entire 10-minute block. So your three data paths show the three different activities that were identified by the preference assessments, where the closed circles show the highest preferred activity that was identified in both assessments, shredding. The closed squares show the activity that was identified as the lowest preferred by the MSWO, transcribing or typing. And the closed triangles showed the activity that was identified as lowest preferred in the paired choice assessment, sweeping. So for Harold, our preference assessments did identify a task that resulted in higher levels of engagement. Harold was much more likely to spend his 10 minutes actively engaged in shredding than he was in typing or sweeping. Additionally, our paired choice assessment, although it took longer, seemed to be more accurate at identifying a task that Harold really seemed to dislike. That is, he spent the least amount of time sweeping relative to the other two tasks. Here are the data for Adam. The graph is laid out exactly the same way. Remember that for Adam, delivering mail was identified as the highest preferred activity in both preference assessments. Filing papers was the lowest preferred activity in the MSWO, and matching socks was the lowest preferred activity in the paired choice. For Adam, he engaged in delivering mail almost 100% of the time of the 10-minute sessions across our assessment. But he also spent most of the time engaged in filing papers. So our MSWO was not discriminatively predictive. That is, it identified an activity as low preferred that Adam still reliably engaged in across a longer period of time with less supports. For our paired choice assessment, it identified matching socks as the lowest preferred activity. And indeed, Adam spent the least amount of time matching socks during our assessments, and the amount of time that he spent matching socks decreased over repeated assessments. Again, these data suggest that our preference assessments are able to identify activities that participants will spend a lot of time engaged in, but our paired choice, although it takes longer, may be more accurate at fully identifying a preference hierarchy. Here are the data for Trevor. Regardless of the type of activity that Trevor was asked to engage in, he reliably engaged in that activity for almost 100% of the 10-minute block across all three of the activities. So for Trevor, he was just really compliant with what we asked him to do, no matter whether or not that was an activity that was identified as being preferred or non-preferred in our previous assessments. So what did we learn from these data? Well, our preference assessments predicted high levels of engagement with highly preferred tasks. For all three of our participants, the activity that was identified as highly preferred resulted in high levels of engagement. This suggests that we may be able to use these assessments to determine which kinds of vocational tasks adolescents with autism spectrum disorders will enjoy, and that may result in those individuals working fairly independently for longer periods of time. The paired choice assessments produced better predicted the tasks that resulted in the lowest levels of engagement. This suggests that when we need to know more than just one preferred task, we may want to use paired choice methods, even though you'll recall they took about twice as long, or about 160 minutes on average, to administer. In addition to knowing about engagement, we wondered about how others would perceive the student's work. So one of the things that we noticed with Trevor, and you might remember that Trevor was the student who reliably engaged in the task regardless of whether it was high preferred or low preferred, is that he just seemed happier doing some tasks than others. So to do this, we did yet another evaluation. We recruited our students' teachers to watch videos of the students completing each of the three tasks, the highest preferred and the two lowest preferred. We gathered the videos from our engagement assessment. So we randomly selected 4 30-second video clips from each task. And we selected these starting at random points in time so that we made sure that we weren't biasing our sample, and spliced the clips together in a random sequence to create a 2-minute video for each task. We showed the teacher the videos of these tasks on an iPad in a random sequence without telling the teacher which tasks were identified as high preferred or low preferred in our assessments. After the teacher watched each 2-minute video, she answered these 3 questions. First, how happy was the adolescent during this video? Ranging from 1, very unhappy, to 5, very happy. Second, how engaged was the adolescent during this video? Ranging from 1, not engaged, to 5, very engaged. And third, how likely would you be to suggest this task as a vocation for this adolescent? Ranging from 1, not likely, to 5, very likely. And we collected these data for 2 participants for whom we could gather consent from their teacher, Harold and Trevor. So again, now we're getting at these qualitative aspects of whether or not our preference assessments are allowing us to predict activities that will result in qualitatively different responding when the adolescent is asked to do the activity for an extended period of time. Here are our data. So what I'm showing you are graphs of the ratings across the 3 different questions that we asked, where each question is shown in a different graph, and the bars, the groupings of bars are for the 2 participants, Harold and Trevor. The black bars show the highest preferred task. The light gray bar, the task that was identified as the lowest preferred by the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment, and the dark gray bar by the preference assessment that was identified as lowest preferred in the paired choice. Now, remember that for Harold, our 3 different kinds of tasks produced very different amounts of engagement when we did qualitative measures of the engagement in our engagement assessment, where the highest preferred task, shredding, resulted in the highest engagement, the lowest preferred task in the MSWO resulted in moderate engagement, and the lowest preferred task in the paired choice resulted in pretty low engagement. Harold's data are shown in the groupings on the left of each of the graphs. Harold's teacher rated shredding and sweeping the highest preferred and the activity identified as lowest preferred by the paired choice as resulting in equal happiness, but suggested that Harold probably didn't seem as happy when he was typing. In terms of engagement, Harold's teacher rated sweeping the lowest preferred task and the one that resulted in the lowest amount of quantitative engagement in our assessments as resulting in the most engagement or the highest engagement ratings, a rating of 5 in our engagement assessment. But in the end, recommended that that shredding be Harold's vocational activity that she would recommend for use of the 3 activities from the videos that she showed. Recall that Trevor's data were a little bit different. So for Trevor, he engaged quantitatively engaged in about equivalent amounts across the 3 activities, the highest preferred, which was greeting, and the 2 lowest preferred, which were cleaning and sorting. Trevor's teacher rated his happiness as being 5 in both greeting and cleaning, but less, and engagement as being both high for greeting and cleaning as well, but had differential ratings in terms of her recommendations. Like Harold's teacher, Trevor's teacher recommended that that greeting, the highest preferred task, be the one that she would recommend as Trevor's vocational task were she to move forward with these. So although Trevor engaged in equivalent amounts of engagement and equivalent amounts of the vocational tasks across the 3 tasks, they still resulted in differential qualitative ratings by Trevor's teacher. So what did we learn from these data? Well, the teachers felt pretty strongly about particular tasks. The fact that the teachers rated the recommendations in a way that aligned with the outcomes of the preference assessments was really interesting to us because it suggested that the teachers were able to label qualitative aspects of the students' engagement with the task that were predictive by the preference assessments that we did at the start of the study. One of the other things that we thought was really interesting was that the engagement ratings were not necessarily strongly correlated with our direct measures of engagement. So remember that for Harold, we obtained very low quantitative measures of engagement, but Harold's teacher rated with the lowest preferred, the sweeping task, which is shown in the dark gray bar here, but Harold's teacher reported very high levels of engagement with that task when shown in the video clips. And it seems like this may be due to how we define engagement. So for Harold, when given the sweeping task and a broom and a dustpan, he would often squat down in front of the dustpan, pick up pieces of trash with his fingers, and move them into the dustpan with his fingers rather than using the broom. We didn't score those as engagement in our assessment, which resulted in those fairly low amounts of engagement, and because we didn't feel like that was appropriate work-related behavior. But it's possible that Harold's teacher viewed that as still being movement towards the completion of the task, and it met perhaps her personal definitions of engagement. Now, we didn't define engagement for the teachers, and we didn't tell them how we had quantitatively measured engagement in these assessments. We did that because we wanted the teachers to use their own judgment calls about this rather than trying to match explicitly what we obtained. But it was interesting to us that that did not actually match for either of the two participants. Another interesting feature is that the teachers actually changed the students' IEP goals or reported that they changed the students' IEP goals as a result of their participation. So both of our students' teachers, both Harold and Trevor's teachers, noted that when they did their annual IEP evals, following seeing the videos of the two participants engaged in different vocational tasks and learning about the students' preferences at the end of the experiment, that they changed the IEP goals for these students to be more focused on tasks that they thought the students would enjoy. We have a long-established use of choices in other domains for assisting individuals with autism spectrum disorders and other disabilities. These are things like choice boards, options for work break, which task are you going to do first, which thing are you going to work for. It may be time that we allow more vocational choices for individuals with ASD as well, and we can modify the procedures that we already have to suit the needs of individuals who don't have complex verbal repertoires that preclude us from using more traditional assessments. We may need to directly measure preference for individuals rather than just looking at what task individuals will comply. Remember that for Trevor, regardless of what task we put in front of him, Trevor engaged in that task really consistently. So he spent almost 100% of every session actively working on the tasks. And Trevor was just a really compliant kid. So if we were to use just the engagement measure to try to predict which task Trevor would enjoy and look at the amount of time that he spent engaged, we might end up in a situation like our poor guy Ed in the cartoon here. When you agree to do lots of things, you end up just doing lots of things, whether you want to do them or not. So just because people will do something doesn't necessarily mean that they want to do it or that they will enjoy doing it. We need to measure their preferences directly. Identifying a vocation is hard enough for typically developing individuals and their caregivers. Because there aren't clear guidelines about how to make good decisions, even when there are lots of resources available to you, identifying a potentially enjoyable vocation and taking the steps to prepare appropriately for that vocation can be really stressful for both the individual and their families. This task is made much more difficult when the individual has weak verbal skills and can't clearly describe the tasks that they enjoy and those that they would prefer to avoid. These weak verbal skills can make it difficult for caregivers to assist with vocational planning. Perhaps we saw some of this difficulty reflected in the vocational IEP goals of our participants before we started the study. Recall that when I first planned the study, I was really jazzed about including the IEP goals that I thought would specify what the participants would enjoy and what they would like to avoid and what the potential career paths were. Recall that several of our participants were 17 years old. So these are individuals who only have a few years remaining in the educational system. Such planning might be critical for individuals who need extensive preparation and practice to be prepared for a job that they love, as might be the case for individuals with autism who are relatively nonverbal. We may need to start early with vocational training for these individuals, assessing their preferences along the way, and making changes in course as those preferences change. Starting early might allow us to develop meaningful IEP goals early on in the educational process for individuals with disabilities. Based on the results of our study, we believe that teachers and other providers might benefit from training in how to identify preferences of nonverbal individuals, and that strategies like the paired choice and MSWO assessments that we used in our study might be useful to improve educational and vocational outcomes for individuals with relatively limited verbal skills. We need to remember that just because individuals don't have the complex verbal skills of their typically developing peers doesn't mean that they don't have the same likes, dislikes, and preferences for all activities, including vocational activities. It's incumbent upon us as providers to try to identify those preferences and tailor the vocational training and activities of individuals to meet their preferences. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening. I think there's a few minutes. I don't know if your platform can take questions or not, but I'm happy to answer them. Or you're certainly welcome to send me an email at the address on the screen. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. St. Peter. I'm going to unmute all lines now, so in case people have any questions. You're unmuted.
And boy, can't we tell.
Any questions? What are your next steps, Dr. St. Peter? I mean, you mentioned what you've learned from this, but I'm curious about your next studies.
Yeah, so we are continuing to recruit participants. We would like to get a larger sample size of participants who complete the entire study so that we can see if the same outcomes hold when we have more than just 3 participants and additional diversity. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think that Molly's results are probably not a fluke. Molly had our lowest verbal abilities of any of our participants, so she was essentially completely nonverbal in terms of very, very limited use of alternative or augmentative communication and very few vocal skills. And I think that we need to modify procedures. I would like to follow up on those modifications that we didn't get a chance to do with Molly so that we can make sure that we're providing services for the full spectrum of students who need it. And then the third thing is to start to disseminate some of these packages in ways that are easy for teachers and other providers to learn how to do. We've got some pretty good data from dissemination of these assessment models in terms of identifying reinforcers that suggest that people can learn them pretty quickly. And I would like to see if the same holds true in these modified versions that are used for vocational training. Lots to do still.
Definitely. Definitely. I know that there's, I don't know if Dr. James is on, but I know that there's a focus on transitions and support groups, and then particular on top of that, vocational interests, transitioning into employment, and what things can others do to structure that a little bit more. So this definitely helps in some ways. Would you have any other suggestions for families and other providers who might be working on this through support group efforts?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to know that there are limitations to the ways that those preferences are frequently identified that families should be aware of, so that if they encounter, we used a pictorial interest inventory, that families are aware of the strengths and limitations of those inventories and whether or not it's appropriate for their particular child. They are very appropriate for some children, but not necessarily for others. And that there are ways to identify those preferences even if the traditional kind of inventory measures are not appropriate for their particular child, and to be good advocates.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? You do have some comments in the chat, just saying it's a wonderful presentation, by the way.
Oh, well, thanks.
Valerie, any last words? I don't want to.
No, thank you so much for taking time to share with everyone details of your research and some of your early findings. It was fascinating.
Well, thank you so much. None of this would have happened without the support of the CED. So I can take credit only for execution. I have to toss the credit back to you guys for making it possible. So thank you guys for everything.
We're looking forward to hearing more. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. With that, we're finished, and again, Dr. St. Peter, thank you for spending your time with us. It's very informative for us in our work.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.